Hey guys, I'm Andrew the Geek Master, and in today's video, we're going to talk about leveling with the gods, the story of a man using an RPG-like system to become as strong as a god and take down the gods that destroyed his world. I'll leave the link to the playlist with all the videos in the cards and in the pinned comment. To make sure you don't miss stories like this, hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and let's get started. In the last chapter, our protagonist Yuan met the tutorial administrator, who looked like a beggar and was twice as tall as Yuan, being a physically powerful being. The administrator was very interested in how Yuan knew of his existence and how he figured out how to request a meeting. He had many questions. Yuan says he only knows the first law of the tutorial, which states that all information about the tutorial must be obtained by the participant's own abilities and cannot be provided by the administrator or the tower. This law was created by the administrator himself, and our protagonist showed no fear in front of the giant figure standing before him, who was over 2 meters tall. The administrator looked into Yuan's eyes. No one could lie to the administrator in the tutorial. He had the power to discern truth from lies in any word spoken, at least within the tutorial he oversaw. The truth was, it didn't matter how Yuan found out that information. As long as no one helped him, there were no issues. But then, Yuan reveals that there's interference from the tower here. The lackey, who had been stalling for time, gave the administrator a nervous grin, letting out a nervous chuckle. When Yuan told him that the lackey wanted to reward him with a sponsorship from Olympus, the administrator's face turned red with rage. He looked at the lackey to confirm the truth, and the moment their eyes met, the administrator simply swung his arm, destroying the lackey's body in an instant. Yes, the clown-like lackey was torn apart, blood dripping. While wiping the blood off his hand, the administrator muttered about the influence of those Olympus scumbags. When the administrator thanked him for his help, Yuan cited the second law of the tutorial, which states that every achievement of a participant must be rewarded with a prize of equal merit. At first, the administrator was speechless. Yuan had already been checked by his subordinates and didn't appear to have any irregularities. But after a brief pause, he laughed, stroking his beard with a big smile, and said Yuan was right. In a way, it was like Yuan had indirectly killed a corrupt lackey, making him the first participant to kill a lackey with power close to a ranker in the second tutorial. The administrator seemed to be having a lot of fun with the situation. He sat on the ground, lost in thought, as this was the first time a lackey had been killed, and he didn't know how to decide on an appropriate reward. Yuan waited patiently for the administrator's decision, and after 5 minutes, he jumped up, having come to a conclusion. He extended his hand to Yuan, which we already know is the common method of point exchange in the tutorial and the tower. Yuan was even disappointed, thinking he would get more points. However, to his surprise, what he received from the administrator left him more than satisfied. The administrator gave him the Mana Master skill. With this, Yuan's mana recovery rate increased slightly, his mana resistance increased slightly, his mana sensitivity increased slightly, and his arcane power went up by 5. The administrator chuckled softly at Yuan's reaction, then bid farewell, saying he had to deal with his other subordinates who were working for Olympus, but they would meet again after the third tutorial. Just like when he appeared, the administrator tore the fabric of space before disappearing. Yuan was completely shocked to receive an S+ rank skill in a simple tutorial, even more so because mana was everything in the tower. The power to control mana, which was the force controlled through the arcane, was the greatest factor that separated the weak from the strong. Mana was more important than anything in the tower. He even formed a sphere of mana in his palm, which was the mana explosion, but this advanced technique required at least 40 points of arcane power. The unstable mana explosion expanded like shrapnel, lightly damaging the ground around him. Yuan was satisfied, but it still wasn't enough. He didn't want to climb the tower and become a ranker for power or wealth. External gods were beings that fit perfectly into the definition of omnipotence. Regaining his former powers was far from enough to fight them again. He needed far more cards to play against them than he had now. Much, much more. After receiving the administrator's reward, there were about 13 hours left until the end of the second tutorial, and Yuan spent all that time hunting. The worms infested more than just the subway station. They populated all the underground spaces. So Yuan spent his time clearing one dungeon after another. He had no choice, since the only monsters in the second tutorial were worms. Meanwhile, in the safe zone, people were arguing because many believed the government would do something for them, while others knew there would probably be more tutorials, and that this was happening everywhere. The people who accepted the reality wanted to secure more food for the safe zone, but they had to avoid the worms above ground to loot the restaurants and convenience stores in the area. Kim Myung-hoon was one of the survivors who continued to manipulate others for his own benefit. The truth is, all this chaos was happening because too many people had survived. It was the result of the survival of all the people who should have been taken down in the first tutorials. Complacent people like that wouldn't change, no matter how hard Yuan tried. But at that moment, the people inside the safe zone began to notice Yuan in the distance. He was carrying a backpack, walking toward the safe zone. People were surprised to see someone outside the safe zone, but they were also concerned about him. Yuan became the center of attention. As he got closer to the zone, the ground beneath him shifted. A worm burst out of the ground to take a bite at Yuan, but he had already hunted thousands of them. Even though it was a surprise attack, it wasn't difficult for Yuan to crush the worm's head. The thing is, this time, he didn't even need to use his knife to kill the worm. He simply stomped on it. And the reason for that is our protagonist's stats. He's already level 26 with 33 strength, 29 dexterity, 30 constitution, 26 perception, and 30 arcane, along with 10,027 points that serve as currency. No one could take their eyes off Yuan. With 5 minutes left until the second tutorial ended, Yuan calmly asked everyone to ignore him and continue whatever discussion they were having. As Yuan slowly entered the safe zone, people whispered to each other, seeing the unbelievable scene. Yuan was only interested in his reward, but he couldn't help but think that some irrelevant jerks were acting like leaders. Then suddenly, Kim Myung-hoon pushed his way through the crowd toward him, saying he was worried. Yuan thought Myung-hoon must be a great actor. In front of all these people, he was able to act so friendly toward a senior student that he had used as a punching bag just the day before. Myung-hoon figured that showing his friendship with Yuan to the crowd would benefit him. But instead of responding to Myung-hoon, Yuan looked around. The atmosphere was tense. There was a mix of fear, caution, and hope in people's eyes. Ignoring them, Yuan walked toward the numbers engraved on the invisible wall at the center of the safe zone that said the maximum capacity was 1,500 people, but only 1,427 were there. Yuan quickly understood that Myung-hoon had forced people to get supplies when the nearest convenience store was just 20 meters away from the safe zone. Myung-hoon said he had no choice, since it was the only way everyone could have a chance to survive. But it was obvious that our protagonist didn't approve of this kind of behavior. Myung-hoon began trembling after seeing Yuan's expression. Yuan was doing nothing but staring at him, but Myung-hoon couldn't help but shrink back. This wasn't the same Yuan he once knew. Myung-hoon even made a speech, saying that if someone wanted to survive in this world now, they had to be a coward. Laws and morals no longer mattered, and many people agreed with him, partly because they were trying to justify their own actions. It was inevitable since the world had changed. To survive, someone else had to be sacrificed. Yuan couldn't help but laugh, to think he would hear something like that from a loser like Kim Myung-hoon. At that moment, the second tutorial finally ended, and all survivors were rewarded with 500 points. They were also given an inventory, a small pouch that fell in front of everyone. Yuan picked it up before telling Myung-hoon that if that's how he wanted to survive, fine. But he wouldn't be a part of it, nor would he tell him what to do. He did give just one piece of advice, though, for Myung-hoon not to cross the line no matter what. Yuan didn't specify what that line was, but he didn't have much time to stand around talking because he was already focused on the next tutorial. And in fact, it didn't take long for the next challenge to begin. This time, the system informed everyone that they had to kill 50 monsters in the sector and collect 50 essences. The mission's time limit was 72 hours, and after that, the sector would be destroyed. A portal would also be activated after 70 hours, but only those who collected 50 essences could use the portal, which was the way to the next sector of the tutorial. It was a very simple mission. Everyone who heard the tutorial's explanation thought it was like a video game. Hunt monsters and collect items. It was a mission that anyone who had ever played a video game would have done at least once. However, the real world wasn't a video game. It wasn't that easy. This time, there were all kinds of monsters: zombies, giant spiders, boars with sharp bristles, huge worms, and even giant centipedes climbing the sides of buildings. It's true that there was still a safe zone, but the goal of the third tutorial wasn't survival. It was hunting. It wasn't possible to progress any further by just hiding in the safe zone. Our protagonist had already collected 132 mana essences, which meant he could pass to the fourth tutorial without doing anything else, but even so, he descended into the subway station, determined to collect 1,000 of those essences. All kinds of monsters gathered in the subway station to create the largest dungeon in the Hongdae sector. All the monsters charged toward Yuan, and seeing the warm reception, Yuan raised his hand and mana began to gather in his palm. With 30 arcane and a little more proficiency in his skill, he created a mana explosion. This time, he successfully created a complete mana explosion, so much so that the system registered it as one of his abilities. Of course, he still couldn't fully control it, but it was enough for a powerful beam of light to shoot from Yuan's hand. And suddenly the heads of the monsters charging at him were blown apart, their charred bodies scattered across the ground. The explosion didn't cover a large area, but its firepower was nothing to scoff at. However, the mana consumption for this ability was very high. It took all of his mana to create a single mana explosion. The technique was simple, but highly destructive. Many people specialized in using mana explosion, but despite being able to create one, Yuan rarely used this ability in battle. With that, Yuan collected the essences from the ground and placed them in his inventory. Then, noticing that the monsters were cautious of him after witnessing the power of the mana explosion, he drew his knife. The third tutorial was about hunting. There were 72 hours left, and Yuan had no intention of wasting a single minute. 2 days had passed since the start of the third tutorial. We see a trio of survivors descending into Hongdae Station in search of a hideout. 2 of them are level 10 men who update us that of 1,400 people, just over 400 remained alive after 2 days. The trio also included a level 10 woman named Lim Ju-yeon, who spotted a convenience store down below. The group's faces lit up. They were worried about running out of food, so the convenience store was like finding an oasis in the desert. As they thought about filling their inventory with food, a large spider was stealthily moving across the ceiling. It dropped directly onto the head of the man running ahead of the group, killing him instantly. Reacting to the bloody scene, Ju-yeon raised her knife, and the other guy, Kang Seong-chan, prepared to strike with his large hammer. One by one, the monsters around the convenience store began to reveal themselves: a zombie, 2 spiders, and 3 man-eating rats. Ju-yeon's heart was racing. Over the past 2 days, the 3 had gone through good and bad times. They had nearly died several times, hunting the monsters outside. They had even leveled up a bit. Everyone was now at level 10, and when the man-eating rats lunged at them, Ju-Yan pointed her knife, which she had bought from the lackey for 200 points. The knife couldn't cut the rat because, unlike the lazy zombies, the man-eating rats easily dodged attacks. As a result, the woman was bitten on the arm by one of the rats, causing her great pain, and meanwhile, Seong-chan, who was busy fighting 2 spiders, let out a scream after being bitten by a zombie. At this point, the two realized they had no chance of winning. She was distracted, watching her friend die, when one of the man-eating rats leaped, aiming for her face. At that moment, something flew through the air, bursting the man-eating rat's body like a balloon. Ju-Yan was confused by the sudden turn of events. She was covered in the rat's blood and guts, which had exploded in front of her, but she didn't have time to find it disgusting. Ju-Yan quickly turned her head toward the convenience store. The broken door opened, and out came our protagonist, looking all irritated because he had been sleeping, but this commotion woke him up. What really impressed the woman was that Yuan had just killed the monster with a soda can, thanks to the monkey eyes skill, which allowed him to easily track the movements of the man-eating rats running around the area. Yuan tossed the other can in his hand, and the zombie biting the man had its head blown up as well. That took care of the immediate threats. Then, one of the giant spiders was cut in half by our protagonist's machete, while the other giant spider was crushed with just one kick. In short, in the blink of an eye, all the monsters were defeated, leaving Ju-Yan speechless, unable even to express her gratitude. However, after a moment of silence, the two thanked the protagonist for saving their lives. Well, the man could barely finish his sentence correctly before collapsing to his knees because the zombie bite must have been incredibly painful. Yuan rummaged through his inventory, pulled out an ointment, and tossed it to Seong-chan. After learning that the man had 17 vitality, he tried to reassure him, saying that he wouldn't die, but he might not be able to use the arm that was bitten anymore. Hearing this, the frightened man quickly applied the ointment to the bite, while our protagonist revealed that he had slept for 6 hours. This was the first time he had slept in 4 days, so he even wanted to sleep longer. The good news was that his fatigue was gone. And because our protagonist is so cautious when it comes to sleeping, he had bought scentless powder from the store, which could completely erase the smell of anything it was applied to, protecting him from monsters with keen senses of smell. Anyway, Yuan had already done what he needed to do, so he started walking away without saying goodbye to the two. That's when the woman asked if he was going to keep hunting. She knew that monsters appeared here more frequently than they did above. According to her, the underground serpent was so dangerous that even a decent-sized group of participants would have a hard time facing it. Our protagonist simply responded that he didn't intend to stay around because this was just his resting place. His hunting grounds were elsewhere, which left the woman somewhat impressed. A few moments later, Ju-Yan and Seong-chan followed Yuan down a strange path that didn't seem to exist before inside Hongdae Station. They descended even further, reaching the second level of the underground. When Yuan asked why they came here knowing it was dangerous, Ju-Yan gripped her weapon tightly with both hands, answering his question with a trembling voice, revealing that outside, things were in complete chaos. Groups had formed, and people started to distrust each other. Right now, people were fighting one another to steal those tiny orbs. In other words, they fled because they were being attacked, and no one wanted to risk their lives chasing them down here, although the protagonist reminded them that they were only alive thanks to him. At that moment, a sound echoed through the area. It was a scream that Ju-Yan and Seong-chan had never heard before. It froze their bodies in place. However, Yuan was used to the scream. Without reacting, he turned his back to the source of the noise, looking at the two people, implying that he could very well kill them and steal their essences too. The two started to back away from Yuan. It was a terrible thing to hear. Now, Yuan was a far scarier enemy than any monster. They knew Yuan already had enough essences, but our protagonist still wanted more. Besides, even if Yuan didn't kill them, they were destined to die without him having to lift a finger. The woman understood that Yuan wanted something from them, and this realization made the protagonist smile. He promised it wouldn't be a bad deal. If they did a good job, he would even give them some essences. Their faces lit up at the offer. They would have been happy just to leave the station in one piece, but they needed to gather 50 essences in a day, so this was an irresistible offer for the two. A few moments later, we see Seong-chan running as fast as he can while a giant underground serpent was closing in on him. It had appeared a few times near the subway entrance. It was a monster capable of swallowing another monster in one bite, making it currently the hardest monster to hunt. It's true that Seong-chan had much higher dexterity compared to others, but the underground serpent was much faster than Seong-chan. When the serpent was right behind Seong-chan with its mouth wide open, a knife flew into the serpent's open mouth. It blinked a few times, then collapsed onto its side. The underground serpent's blood spilled everywhere. Other monsters were chasing Seong-chan, and suddenly they all started spraying blood everywhere. Starting with the underground serpent, monsters unknown to him began dropping dead one by one. Essences continually fell to the ground, and Seong-chan quickly grabbed the rolling essence. In just the past 2 hours, they managed to collect more than 50 essences. With another successful hunt, Yuan gave Seong-chan one more essence. It seemed that every 5 or 6 essences, he would give one to the man. Then, Seong-chan noticed that Ju-yeon was a little late, but Yuan was sure she would return soon. And by now, we all understood that the job Yuan gave them was to act as bait for the monster hordes. When Seong-chan asked what level Yuan was at, our protagonist didn't respond, only saying that his level had stopped increasing, which meant his level must be so high that it wasn't rising from fighting these monsters. As a hint, Yuan told him not to ask about other people's levels and stats, as they are personal information, and when asked, he shouldn't answer. This made the man remember that Yuan had asked him about his vitality before, to which Yuan joked that he really should have just let the guy's arm rot. But the real advice he gave was that the man had to hunt every now and then. His priority should be leveling up and gathering more essences. Well, at that moment, Ju-yeon finally returned, desperate, with another horde of monsters chasing her. Yuan immediately stood up. There wasn't much time left, and it was time to continue the massacre. Following Yuan's advice, Seong-chan grabbed the hammer in his hand and smashed the head of the underground serpent. When the serpent stopped twitching, Seong-chan shouted in joy upon receiving the level-up message. He and Ju-yeon had managed to take down an underground serpent on their own. They were leveling up, just as Yuan had instructed them to do. An essence came out of the underground serpent's mouth. That essence was theirs. It wasn't Yuan who defeated the serpent, but them. In this way, they finished gathering the 50 essences needed to pass the third tutorial. They had only managed to collect 20 before meeting Yuan, but now they had completed what had seemed like an impossible task. Yuan also thanked them for their help, since it was thanks to them that his hunting had become 50% more efficient. With about an hour left until the portal to the next phase was activated, Yuan said it was time for them to return to the surface. The two were happy to hear that, but wondered if it was still complete chaos outside. And indeed, outside, the portal was slowly turning red, and once it became a bright crimson, people could move on to the next stage of the tutorial. Of course, this only applied to people who met the requirements and had 50 essences. For example, this man had 45 essences and still needed 5 more to meet the requirement. He had 2.5 hours left. If he hurried and acted quickly, he might be able to get them. He had even leveled up a bit, so hunting had become much easier. However, there was no guarantee that he would actually get the 5 more essences, which is why he and his friend, who needed 8 essences, came up with a plan. The problem was that everyone else had the same idea. Many people had gathered around the center of the safe zone. They watched what others were doing from a distance and planned to steal the essence from other people and rush to the next tutorial. Kim Myung-hoon, who had become the leader of the largest faction, saw them from a distance and headed their way, drawing everyone's attention. He wasn't just big and a good fighter, but also extremely charismatic, which is why he managed to create a much larger group than these other guys. His group had at least 50 people now, making him the most influential person in the tutorial. Their groups had clashed before, but with a larger group, things had changed, and Myung-hoon was well aware of that. He said that a bloodbath was about to happen, indicating that Myung-hoon had spent the last 70 hours gathering people. In the last 2 hours, he planned to take advantage of the fact that he had to pass through the gate to reach the next tutorial, a scheme to snatch essence at the final moment. In short, his group of 50 would definitely defeat the smaller groups, including these guys. But he assured them he wouldn't touch them if they handed over 700 essences. That was a huge number. If he had asked for 100, the man would have given them to avoid a confrontation. But that number ruled out that option since they barely had 300 essences. Sensing their reaction, Myung-hoon decided to ask for just 400 essences, promising that with that, he would leave them alone. The guy knew that if they rejected this offer, a widespread fight would break out, and with a numerical disadvantage of 50 against 20, they would definitely lose. That's when someone suddenly entered the safe zone. Pushing through the crowd, a couple was heading toward the center of the zone. They were fearless, walking past Myung-hoon and his gang. They had familiar faces. People remembered seeing them at least once, but they hadn't left a lasting impression. But what really caught everyone's attention was the arrival of a man carrying a large box. He had an unforgettable face, black hair with a short cut, a sharp jawline, and clear black eyes. It was Yu-won, the only participant who wandered outside the safe zone during the second tutorial. Myung-hoon immediately interrupted his discussion with the other group because Yu-won's presence changed everything. There wasn't a single person in the Hongdae sector who didn't know Yu-won. Yu-won walked to the center of the safe zone and dropped a box, and the first person to welcome Yu-won's return was Myung-hoon. Myung-hoon asked if he had managed to gather enough essences, to which Yu-won replied that it was obvious. In fact, when he opened his inventory, everyone was shocked by the countless orbs that began to fall into the large box. Seeing a box fill up with essence was enough to drive all the participants crazy, knowing there were more than 1,000 in there. Myung-hoon couldn't hide his frustration and envy upon seeing how many essences our protagonist had gathered. For a moment he was scared, but he quickly thought there was no need to feel that way because he had gathered at least 50 men. No matter how strong Yu-won was, he was just one person and couldn't fight them all. However, before Myung-hoon made any move, Yu-won ordered him to look at the ground. A line forming a circle around Yu-won appeared on the ground out of nowhere. After seeing Myung-hoon stop, Yu-won looked at the other participants with greedy eyes. He knew everyone needed this and was desperate, and the countless essences in the box were enough to attract the attention of all the participants, amplifying their desperation. Yu-won was very clear when he said he didn't need those essences, but he wouldn't give them away for free. He would trade each essence for 100 points. Again, he pointed to the line on the ground and said that anyone who wanted to buy some would first need to ask for permission before entering the circle. 100 points per essence was a pretty steep price, but considering that essences weren't even sold in the store, Yu-won was their only option. Myung-hoon quickly brandished his weapon, calling Yu-won selfish, claiming he could give them away for free and save hundreds of lives. The chapter ends with Myung-hoon asking what our protagonist will do if they don't have the money. That's where we'll end this video. Please comment on what you think of this story and what you think will happen between Yu-won and Myung-hoon. To see the continuation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and leave a like to help us out. Thanks for watching, and until the next adventure.